The metallic tang of copper flooded my mouth the moment I opened my mind to the warp. I was a 17-year-old scribe's apprentice in Hive Tertius. Now, I am something else entirely. A conduit for forces that should never touch reality. You call me monster, but I call myself awakened. This is my confession, and it is the truth they do not want you to know about what happens when the Emperor's light fails to shield you from the darkness beyond the veil. Listen carefully, for this knowledge may be the difference between salvation and damnation, when the signs begin to manifest in someone you love. Chapter 1. Normal Life. The recycled air of Hive Tertius carried the familiar scent of promethium fumes and human sweat when I first noticed something was wrong. My name is Kale Voss, and I was 17 years old when my life ended and something far worse began. I worked in sub-level 847 of the administrative sector, a cramped warren of cubicles and data slates where thousands of us processed the endless paperwork that kept our section of the Hive functioning. The job was mind-numbing, logging shipment manifests, cross-referencing labor assignments, calculating nutrient ration distributions. But it was honest work, and in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, honest work was a blessing not everyone received. My supervisor, scribe adept Heron Maltus, was a thin man with pale skin that had never seen natural sunlight. Like most of us in the deep Hive, he bore the characteristic stoop of someone who had spent decades hunched over data terminals. His augmetic eye whirred softly as he processed information, and the mechadendrite emerging from his left temple clicked rhythmically against his skull, a nervous habit he'd developed over his 43 years of service to the administratum. "Voss," he called to me that morning, his voice carrying the typical nasal tone of someone who had undergone vocal cord modification for data transmission purposes. "Report to Terminal 847 Delta 12. The shipping manifests from Dock Level 200 require verification." I nodded, gathering my slate stylus and authentication stamps. The walk to Terminal 847 Delta 12 took exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. I had timed it dozens of times, as precise routine was the foundation of all administrative work. The terminal itself was a standard pattern, manufactured on Forge World Metallica sometime in the 39th millennium. Its machine spirit was temperamental but reliable, requiring exactly 17 seconds to boot up and access the central databanks. The manifests were routine. 14,000 tons of processed protein paste from Agri Level 12, 847 replacement servo skulls for the Maintenance Guild, 23,000 meters of reinforced HAB unit construction material. Each item required verification against master records, cross-referencing against guild production quotas, and final authentication with my personal seal. The work was methodical, predictable, safe. My living quarters were located in residential block Gamma 7, sub-level 833. A standard HAB unit measuring exactly 3.5 meters by 2.8 meters with a ceiling height of 2.2 meters. The walls were painted in Regulation Administrative Sector beige, a color psychologically designed to promote calm productivity and reduce worker stress. My possessions were few. A regulation cot, a small shrine to the Emperor, featuring a ceramic aquila blessed by Chaplain Mordius during the Feast of the Ascension. 3 years prior, a storage locker containing 2 additional work uniforms and a data slate for personal use loaded with approved recreational texts. The shrine was my pride. I had saved for 8 months to purchase the ceramic aquila, forgoing my weekly recreational ration of amasec to afford it. Every morning before my shift, I would light a small stick of incense, real incense, not the synthetic substitute, and offer prayers for the Emperor's protection. The prayers were simple, memorized from the uplifting primer. The Emperor protects, the Emperor provides. In his name we serve. In his light we are guided. My parents had died when I was 12, a common enough tragedy in the Hive cities. Father had been consumed by a runaway servitor in the waste reclamation levels, a mechanical malfunction that claimed 14 workers before tech adept Zorian managed to shut down the rogue machine. Mother had simply stopped returning from her shifts in the textile factories 6 months later. The Arbites listed her as missing presumed deceased, but I knew she had chosen to walk into the Underhive rather than face another day without her husband. The orphanage had been a grim place, but it provided the basic education that qualified me for administrative service. I learned to read, write, perform mathematical calculations to the third decimal place, and most importantly, I learned to follow orders without question. Obedience was survival. Curiosity was dangerous. Questions were heretical. My fellow workers were good people. Emperor bless them. There was Jeskin Hollow, a middle-aged woman who had been processing shipping manifests for 23 years and could spot irregularities with supernatural precision. She kept a picked capture of her husband in her workstation. He had died fighting the Ork incursion on the planet's surface 2 decades ago, but she still spoke to his image every morning. "Morning, love," she would whisper to the faded photograph. "Emperor willing, I'll see you again tonight." Then there was young Marcus Vale, barely 15 and new to the department. He still possessed the enthusiasm that most of us had lost after our first year in the administrative sector. Marcus would actually smile while working, humming half-remembered hymns under his breath. His optimism was infectious, and several of the older scribes had taken to protecting him from the harsher aspects of hive life. Our section head was Adept Primus Valdris Core, a woman in her 60s who had served the administratum for 48 years. She had earned the right to wear the brass stylus pendant that marked her as a senior administrator, and her left hand had been replaced with an augmetic calculation device that could process numerical data with mechanical precision. Despite her authority, she was known for her fairness and her genuine concern for her subordinates' welfare. Life in Hive Tertius followed predictable patterns. Work shifts began at 06 War Imperial Standard and concluded at 18:00. Meal periods were at 12 or and 18:30, featuring nutrition paste, reclaimed water, and vitamin supplements. Personal time ran from 19 or to 23 hours, after which sleep period was mandatory. On the 7th day of each week, we attended mandatory religious services conducted by Chaplain Mordius in the sector cathedral. The cathedral was one of the few beautiful things in our section of the Hive. Built in the classical Imperial style, it featured soaring arches, stained glass windows depicting the Emperor's great victories, and an altar made from genuine Terran marble. The acoustics were perfect, designed to carry the chaplain's voice to every corner of the vast space. When Chaplain Mordius delivered his sermons, his words seemed to carry divine authority. "The Emperor's light shines in the darkest places," he would intone, his voice echoing off the cathedral's walls. "In his name, we find purpose. In his service, we find meaning. Let no heretical thought dim the purity of your faith. Let no alien corruption poison your devotion. In unity, there is strength. In obedience, there is peace." I believed every word. The Emperor was our protector, our guide, our salvation in a galaxy filled with horrors. My faith was absolute, unquestioning. I wore my devotion like armor, convinced it would shield me from any danger. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday. I was processing routine cargo manifests when I noticed an error in the documentation. A shipment of industrial lubricants was listed as weighing 23,947 kilograms, but the transport capacity was only rated for 20,000 kilograms. Such discrepancies were common: clerical errors, transportation miscalculations, sometimes deliberate fraud by corrupt merchants. But when I looked at the manifest again, the numbers had changed. Now it read 19,147 kilograms, well within the transport's capacity. I blinked, certain I had misread the original figures. Data slates occasionally suffered from display glitches, especially older models like ours. I made a notation in my log and continued working. The next day, it happened again. A personnel roster listed 1,247 workers in Sector Gamma, but when I double-checked the figure, by the end of the week, I had documented 17 separate instances of data changing before my eyes. Numbers shifting, names altering, sometimes entire lines of text rewriting themselves. My fellow workers began to notice my distraction. "You seem troubled, young Voss," Adept Primus Core observed during our weekly performance review. "Is there something affecting your work efficiency?" I wanted to tell her about the changing data, but how could I explain something so impossible? Instead, I cited fatigue. and requested permission to visit the medical bay for a stim treatment. She granted the request with a concerned frown. The medical bay was located on sub-level 843, staffed by Medicae Junitus Hahn, a competent if unimaginative man who had been treating administrative sector personnel for 15 years. He examined me thoroughly, checking my eyes, testing my reflexes, scanning my brain patterns with a handheld Auspex. Mild optical strain, he concluded, common among data scribes. I'm prescribing eye drops and recommending you reduce your terminal time by 15 minutes per shift. The eye drops helped with the physical discomfort, but they did nothing to stop the data from changing. If anything, the phenomenon was becoming more frequent. By the following week, I was witnessing alterations in real time, numbers flowing like liquid across the screen, text reshaping itself as I watched. That's when I realized the truth that would damn me forever. The data wasn't changing at all. I was seeing through it, perceiving the lies and errors hidden beneath the surface. Somehow, impossibly, I was seeing the truth that lurked behind the administratum's carefully maintained records. And in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, seeing hidden truths is the first sign of psychic awakening. Chapter 2. Strange Signs. The taste of ozone began to linger in my mouth during the third week. It was subtle at first, just a metallic tang that I attributed to the hive's recycled air filtration system. But as the days passed, the flavor intensified, coating my tongue with the distinctive sharpness that preceded electrical storms. The problem was, we were buried 700 meters beneath the hive's surface. No natural lightning had touched our section in centuries. I mentioned it to Marcus Vale during our midday meal break. We were sitting in Nutrition Station 7, consuming our daily ration of protein paste and synthetic vegetables, while discussing the morning's work assignments. Probably just the air processors acting up again, he said, spooning grey paste from his regulation bowl. Remember last month when everything smelled like burning rubber? Took the tech adepts 3 days to fix whatever was wrong with the atmospheric systems. But I knew this was different. The ozone taste was accompanied by other sensations, a tingling in my fingertips when I touched metal objects, occasional flashes of light in my peripheral vision, and a growing sense that I could hear conversations from adjoining rooms, even through the hive's thick walls. The wall hearing started the following Tuesday. I was working alone at Terminal 847 Delta 12, processing export licenses for a shipment of industrial components, when I began to perceive voices from the adjacent office. At first, I assumed someone had activated the internal communication system, but the voices were too clear, too intimate. "The Cadian shipment is 3 days overdue," said a voice I recognized as Scribe Major Joris from the import division. "If it doesn't arrive by week's end, we'll have to file a loss report." "Losses have been running high lately," replied another voice, Adept Secundus Vallo from the same department. "The warp storms in the Tertius subsector are worse than anyone's admitting. I've heard whispers that entire convoys are vanishing without a trace." I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to understand how sound could travel so clearly through reinforced rockcrete. But the voices weren't coming through the wall. They were coming from inside my head. Somehow, I was hearing their conversation from 30 meters away, through multiple walls and across an entirely different administrative section. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was experiencing psychic phenomena. The very thought should have filled me with terror, but instead, I felt a strange exhilaration. For the first time in my 17 years, something interesting was happening to me. That night, alone in my HAB unit, I tested my newfound ability. I concentrated on the wall separating my quarters from the adjacent unit, occupied by Factotum Nels, a middle-aged man who worked in the communications division. Within moments, I could hear him muttering to himself as he prepared his evening meal. "Throne damned ration dispensers," he grumbled. "This paste is getting thinner every week, probably mixing it with recycled sewage now." I pulled back, breaking the psychic connection. My head throbbed with a dull ache, but I was amazed by the clarity of the experience. It wasn't telepathy exactly, more like enhanced auditory perception that could bypass physical barriers. I tested it repeatedly over the next hour, listening to fragments of conversation from across the residential block. Mrs. Kemmel in Unit 7G was arguing with her teenage son about his poor performance in the junior scribe training program. Supervisor Holt in Unit 7C was praying at his personal shrine, asking the Emperor to cure his wife's wasting disease. Young Tern in Unit 7A was weeping quietly, though I couldn't determine why. The ability was intoxicating. For my entire life, I had been isolated in my own small world, knowing only what the administratum deemed necessary for me to know. Now, suddenly, I could access the private thoughts and conversations of hundreds of people. The temptation to explore this new sense was overwhelming. But with the enhanced perception came disturbing side effects. Food began to taste different. Not just the metallic ozone flavor, but as if I could perceive additional layers of flavor that had always been hidden. The protein paste revealed hints of the animals it had been rendered from, carrying emotional impressions of fear and pain that made me gag. The synthetic vegetables tasted of chemical processing and artificial growth accelerators that burned my enhanced palate. Sleep became increasingly difficult. My HAB unit's walls seemed thin as paper, and I could hear the dreams and nightmares of everyone in the surrounding units. Mrs. Kemmel dreamed of her dead husband, reliving the plasma explosion that had killed him in the foundries. Supervisor Holt experienced recurring nightmares about his wife's disease, watching her waste away despite his desperate prayers. Young Tern's dreams were filled with images of darkness and despair that left me shaken. Worse still were the dreams that weren't dreams at all, but visions of things that shouldn't exist. I saw vast entities swimming through oceans of light and shadow, creatures with geometries that hurt to perceive, and worlds where reality itself had been twisted into impossible configurations. These visions came with sensory impressions of heat, cold, pressure, and textures that no human should be able to experience. The visions were accompanied by whispers, not the conversations I was intercepting from neighboring HAB units, but something else entirely. Voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, yet somehow understood. They spoke of power, of knowledge, of freedom, from the constraints of physical reality. They promised answers to questions I hadn't known I was asking. "You are awakening," the voices whispered. "The chains that bind lesser minds are breaking. Soon, you will see the truth that lies beyond the thin veil of reality." I tried to pray, reciting the familiar litanies from the uplifting primer, but the words felt hollow and meaningless. The Emperor's light seemed distant, overwhelmed by the growing darkness that was seeping into my consciousness. My faith, once absolute and unquestioning, began to develop cracks. At work, my behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. I would stop mid-sentence during conversations, distracted by psychic impressions from colleagues. Scribe Adept Maltus's thoughts were particularly disturbing. Beneath his mild exterior lurked bitter resentment toward the administratum, dark fantasies of revenge against his superiors, and a secret addiction to combat stims that he acquired through black market channels. "Voss, you seem distracted," Adept Primus Core observed during our weekly review. "Your productivity has decreased by 12% over the past month. Is there something troubling you?" I wanted to confess everything: the strange abilities, the whispers, the growing sense that reality was far more complex than I had ever imagined. But the words wouldn't come. Some instinct warned me that revealing the truth would be catastrophic. "I've been having trouble sleeping," I said instead. "Perhaps I could be reassigned to day shift duties that don't require as much concentration." She studied me carefully, her augmetic calculation device clicking softly as it processed data. "Sleep disturbances are common among scribes your age. I'll arrange for you to receive mild sedatives from the medical bay. But Voss, if there are other issues affecting your performance, you must report them immediately. The administratum cannot function if personnel fail to maintain proper mental discipline." The sedatives helped, but only temporarily. They dulled my psychic perceptions, making the whispers fainter and the visions less vivid. But they also left me feeling disconnected from the growing power within me. After 3 days, I stopped taking them altogether. That was my first conscious choice to embrace what was happening to me rather than resist it. Looking back, that moment marked the point where Kael Voss, loyal servant of the Emperor, began to die, and something else began to emerge from his corpse. The whispers grew stronger after I stopped taking the sedatives. They began to carry specific information, details about my colleagues' personal lives, advanced knowledge of administrative decisions, and glimpses of events occurring in distant parts of the hive. When Supervisor Malthus received a disciplinary hearing for his stim addiction 3 days before it was officially announced, I knew the information had come from the whispers. When the transport carrying young Marcus's brother was destroyed by pirates in the outer system, I had already seen it in my visions 2 weeks prior. I was becoming something other than human, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly alive. Chapter 3. Truth Glimpsed. The first time I saw through someone else's eyes, I was processing routine personnel transfers, when suddenly I wasn't sitting at Terminal 847 Delta 12 anymore. I was standing in the Hive Primus Command Center, 7 kilometers above my station, looking down at tactical displays showing troop movements across 3 continents. "The Orkish incursions are spreading faster than projected," said a voice I didn't recognize, a military officer with the distinctive accent of the Cadian shock troops. "We've lost contact with forward operating bases Tertius 7 through Tertius 12. That's 6,000 Imperial Guard troops, gone silent in less than 48 hours. Through borrowed eyes, I watched as red icons spread across the tactical display like a plague. Each icon represented hundreds of deaths, entire defensive positions overrun by the green tide. The scale of the disaster was staggering. Our hive city was under siege, and somehow the administratum had kept this information from filtering down to the lower levels. "What about civilian evacuation protocols?" asked another voice, this one bearing the authority of high command. "Impossible," replied the Cadian officer. "We have 17 billion souls in this hive complex. Even if we had the transport capacity, which we don't, we'd need 6 months minimum to evacuate the primary population centers. The Orks will be at our walls within 3 weeks." The vision ended abruptly, leaving me gasping at my terminal. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely hold my stylus. Around me, my fellow scribes continued their work, oblivious to the approaching catastrophe. They were processing shipping manifests and inventory reports, while an unstoppable alien horde advanced toward our homes. I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, a stress-induced hallucination brought on by my recent sleep disturbances. But the details were too precise, too consistent with the subtle signs I had been noticing in the administrative data. The increased military requisitions, the sudden spike in medical supply orders, the unexplained delays in civilian transport schedules. All of it pointed to a major military crisis being kept secret from the general population. That evening, I attempted to access higher-level data networks using my terminal credentials. The attempt was immediately blocked, but not before I caught a glimpse of classified casualty reports. The numbers were horrifying. 127,000 Imperial Guard dead or missing in action over the past month, with casualty rates increasing exponentially each day. The whispers began to make more sense now. They weren't random psychic phenomena, they were communications from the immaterial realm where consciousness could transcend physical limitations. The entities speaking to me had access to information that spanned vast distances and penetrated the most secure military networks. "You see now," the voices murmured in my mind as I lay in my HAB unit that night. "The lies they tell to maintain order. The truths they hide to preserve their power. Reality is far more complex than they would have you believe." I wanted to resist their influence, to cling to my faith in the Emperor and the Imperial system that had shaped my entire life. But the evidence was overwhelming. The administratum routinely concealed vital information from its own personnel. The military commanders were fighting a losing war while telling the civilian population that all was well. The entire structure of Imperial society was built on deception and willful ignorance. "Show me more," I whispered to the darkness. The response was immediate. My consciousness was torn from my body and hurled across the hive city, through walls and barriers, into spaces I had never seen. I witnessed tech adepts in the deep machine shops, their bodies more metal than flesh, worshipping the Omnissiah through ritual that bordered on heretical mechanization. I observed Arbites interrogating captured criminals, using methods that would have horrified me a month earlier. I saw nobles in the upper hive levels living in luxury, while billions starved in the depths below. But the most devastating revelation came when my consciousness was drawn into the private chambers of Chaplain Mordius himself. The man who delivered inspiring sermons about faith and devotion was kneeling before a hidden shrine, but the imagery was wrong. Instead of the familiar Aquila, the shrine featured symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when looked at directly. The chaplain was praying, but the words weren't high Gothic liturgies. They were something else entirely, syllables that hurt to hear and understand. "Great powers of the warp," he intoned. "Grant me the strength to maintain the illusion. Let the faithful remain blind to the truth of their condition. In darkness, there is peace. In ignorance, there is stability." The revelation shattered something fundamental in my worldview. Chaplain Mordius, the spiritual leader whose sermons had guided my faith for years, was himself a practitioner of forbidden arts. He was deliberately keeping his congregation in ignorance, using psychic manipulation to reinforce their compliance and docility. I pulled back from the vision, my consciousness snapping back to my own body like a rubber band released. The HAB unit felt small and confining after experiencing such expanded awareness. Everything around me, the regulation furniture, the ceramic aquila on my shrine, the approved recreational texts, seemed like props in an elaborate theatrical performance designed to keep me content and obedient. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to attend the scheduled religious service. Instead, I wandered the commercial districts of sub-level 845, observing my fellow citizens with new eyes. I could sense their thoughts and emotions like heat radiating from their bodies. The merchant selling reconstituted food paste was calculating how to dilute his product further without triggering customer complaints. The Arbites patrol was discussing which gang territories to raid for the greatest profit potential. The work crews repairing atmospheric processors were gossiping about the increasing frequency of equipment failures that were actually sabotaged by heretical cults. Everyone was lying to everyone else, and everyone was being lied to in return. The entire social structure of the hive was built on layers of deception, each group maintaining its own version of reality while remaining ignorant of the larger truths. "This is the galaxy you were born into," the whispers explained. "A universe where truth is heresy and ignorance is virtue. But you have been chosen for something greater. You have been given the gift of perception that transcends these artificial limitations." I returned to my HAB unit and destroyed the ceramic aquila on my shrine. The action felt like breaking chains that had bound me since childhood. The Emperor's protection had always been an illusion. What mattered was the power growing within me, the ability to perceive and manipulate reality in ways that made me something more than human. That night, I experimented with my abilities more systematically. I discovered I could project my consciousness into electronic systems, reading data that should have been encrypted beyond my access level. I could influence the dreams of sleeping colleagues, planting suggestions and images that would affect their waking behavior. Most disturbing of all, I could sense the presence of other psychically gifted individuals scattered throughout the hive. Dozens of them, all struggling with similar awakenings. One presence was particularly strong, located somewhere in the residential levels above my own sector. The psychic signature felt familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have encountered it before. I reached out cautiously, establishing a tentative connection. "Who are you?" came the mental response, tinged with fear and excitement in equal measure. "My name is Kale Voss," I replied, amazed that I could communicate telepathically. "I work in the administrative sector. I think something is happening to us." "Yes," came the response. "Something wonderful and terrible. I am Lydia Tarch, Communications Division. I've been experiencing changes for 3 weeks now. Are there others like us?" Over the following hours, we established contact with 17 other awakening Psykers throughout the hive. Each had experienced similar phenomena: enhanced perceptions, psychic visions, the ability to access information through supernatural means. We formed a loose network, sharing knowledge and supporting each other through the frightening transformation we were all undergoing. But our activities had not gone unnoticed. The warp signatures generated by our psychic communications were like beacons to those who knew how to detect them. And in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the Imperium has developed very sophisticated methods for identifying and dealing with unsanctioned Psykers. The black ships were already on their way. Chapter 4. Creeping Dread. The first sign of pursuit came during a routine morning shift, when I sensed a presence in the administrative sector that felt wrong, cold, focused, and utterly without mercy. I was processing textile production reports when the sensation hit me like ice water in my veins. Someone was scanning the area with psychic senses far more powerful and disciplined than my own. I immediately ceased all supernatural activity, pulling my consciousness back into my physical body and attempting to suppress the warp energies that had become as natural as breathing. But it was too late. The presence had noticed the sudden cessation of psychic emanations, and that itself was suspicious to a trained hunter. Through my enhanced senses, I could perceive the intruder moving through the sector with practiced stealth. Male, augmented extensively, carrying weapons designed specifically for dealing with supernatural threats. A witch hunter from the Ordo Hereticus, one of the Inquisition's most feared agents. His thoughts were disciplined and focused. 17 potential Psykers had been detected in this sector, and he would eliminate them all before they could pose a threat to Imperial stability. "Attention all personnel," came the announcement over the sector's communication system. "This is Interrogator Dane of the Ordo Hereticus. All workstations are to remain occupied while we conduct routine security inspections. Any individual who leaves their assigned post without authorization will be detained for questioning." Around me, my fellow workers continued their duties, but I could sense their growing anxiety. Most of them had no idea why Inquisition agents would be interested in a routine administrative sector, but they understood enough to be afraid. In the 41st millennium, attention from the Inquisition was never a positive development. I tried to contact the other awakening Psykers through our telepathic network, but I discovered that someone had erected a psychic dampening field across the entire sector. My abilities were severely reduced, barely sufficient for local thought reading. Our network had been compromised, cut off from each other just when we needed coordination most. Interrogator Dane moved systematically through the workstations, conducting brief interviews with each scribe. I watched through peripheral vision as he spoke with Jeskin Hollow, her nervousness spiking as he asked probing questions about unusual activities or suspicious behavior among her colleagues. She answered honestly, having no knowledge of the supernatural phenomena occurring around her, but her fear was palpable. "Have you noticed any changes in the behavior of your co-workers?" he asked her. "Increased distraction, unusual fatigue, expressions of doubt regarding Imperial doctrine?" "No, sir," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Everyone has been performing their duties normally. Well, except for young Voss. He seemed troubled lately, but he requested medical attention for eye strain." My blood turned to ice as I realized she was unwittingly directing the interrogator's attention toward me. In her innocence, she was providing exactly the kind of information that would mark me as a person of interest to the Inquisition as investigation. I had perhaps 10 minutes before Dane reached my station. 10 minutes to decide whether to run, hide, fight, or surrender. Each option carried terrible consequences, but staying put meant certain death or worse, transportation to the black ships for processing as an unsanctioned Psyker. The whispers in my mind grew urgent, offering guidance that came with a price I wasn't sure I was ready to pay. "You can escape this," the voices promised, "but you must abandon all pretense of humanity. You must embrace what you are becoming fully, without reservation or regret. The power exists within you to walk between worlds, to slip through cracks in reality that mundane minds cannot perceive." I thought of my small hab unit, my few possessions, the routine life that had provided security, if not happiness. Then I thought of the black ships, the nightmare vessels where unsanctioned Psykers were subjected to procedures that stripped away everything that made them human. The choice was between abandoning my old life voluntarily or having it destroyed against my will. "Tell me what to do," I whispered to the voices. The response came as a flood of information. Techniques for manipulating local space-time, methods for rendering myself invisible to psychic detection, ways to tap into the warp's infinite energy reserves. The knowledge was intoxicating and horrifying in equal measure, carrying implications that would have terrified the person I had been just weeks earlier. I began to implement the first technique, just as Interrogator Dane finished interviewing Marcus Vale 3 stations away from my position. The air around me began to shimmer slightly as I bent light waves around my body, creating a localized field of optical distortion. To casual observation, I appeared to be sitting normally at my terminal, but anyone who looked closely would notice that something was fundamentally wrong with my visual presence. The sensation of manipulating reality directly was indescribable. It felt like grasping the fundamental equations that governed physical laws and rewriting them through sheer force of will. Energy flowed through me from some impossible source, carrying whispers of vast intelligences that existed beyond the boundaries of normal space-time. "Interesting," came a voice directly behind me. "A spontaneous manifestation of epsilon-level reality manipulation. Quite impressive for someone with no formal training." I spun around to find Interrogator Dane standing directly behind my workstation, having somehow approached without my enhanced senses detecting him. Up close, he was even more terrifying than I had perceived psychically. Tall, lean, with mechanical eyes that recorded everything they observed, and facial scarification that indicated extensive combat experience with supernatural entities. "Please don't move, Scribe Voss," he continued conversationally. "The weapon I'm holding is designed specifically for dealing with individuals like yourself. A single shot will sever your connection to the warp while leaving you alive for questioning. The process is reportedly quite unpleasant." Around us, my fellow workers continued their duties, apparently unable to see or hear our conversation. Some form of localized psychic manipulation was keeping them ignorant of what was transpiring directly in their midst. "You have 2 choices," Dane explained. "Voluntary cooperation with Imperial authorities, which will result in immediate transportation for processing and potential service as a sanctioned Psyker, or continued resistance, which will result in immediate execution, followed by posthumous investigation of your associates." I could sense his absolute certainty that these were the only possible outcomes. In his experience, unsanctioned Psykers either surrendered quietly or died violently. There were no other alternatives. He had hunted dozens of my kind and never failed to resolve the situation according to Imperial protocol. But Interrogator Dane had never encountered someone who had been receiving instruction from entities that existed outside the normal constraints of reality. The voices in my mind provided guidance that transcended his experience and training. "There is a third choice," I said quietly, "one that your limited understanding cannot comprehend." Before he could respond, I implemented the second technique the voices had provided. Instead of manipulating light or energy, I manipulated space itself, creating a localized fold in 3-dimensional reality. The effect was to step sideways out of normal space-time into a parallel dimensional layer where the physical laws operated according to different principles. From Dane's perspective, I simply vanished. One moment I was sitting at my terminal, the next moment the chair was empty, and his psychic sensors could detect no trace of my presence. But I hadn't actually left. I was standing less than 2 meters from him, existing in a dimensional space that intersected with normal reality, but remained separate from it. "Impossible," he muttered, his mechanical eyes scanning the immediate area with increasing intensity. His psychic detection equipment registered only empty space where I had been sitting moments before. From my position in the dimensional fold, I could observe him clearly while remaining completely undetectable. The sensation was disorienting. I existed in a space that was simultaneously part of the physical world and separate from it. Colors appeared different here, Sound carried strangely, and I could sense the underlying mathematical structure that held reality together. Dane activated a more powerful scanning device, one that projected visible energy patterns as it searched for any trace of my psychic signature. The beam passed directly through the space I occupied without registering my presence. According to every instrument at his disposal, I had ceased to exist. "Control, this is Dane," he spoke into a concealed communication device. "Target Voss has demonstrated advanced reality manipulation capabilities, possible theta-level manifestation, requesting backup and specialized containment equipment." The response crackled through his augmetic hearing enhancement. "Negative, interrogator. No backup available. Sector-wide sweep is taking priority. Contain or eliminate the target using available resources." I watched him process this information, his disciplined mind calculating new tactical approaches. He was alone, facing an opponent whose capabilities exceeded his preparation and equipment. But rather than retreat, he simply adapted his strategy. "Scribe Voss," he called out to the apparently empty workstation. "I know you're still here. Dimensional phasing is an advanced technique, but it has limitations. You can't maintain the effect indefinitely without risking dissolution. And every second you spend in that folded space increases the chance that something else will notice your presence." His words carried an ominous truth that I could feel in the fabric of reality around me. The dimensional fold was indeed unstable, requiring constant energy expenditure to maintain. But more disturbing were the things that I was beginning to sense in the spaces between spaces. Entities that existed in the gaps between dimensions, attracted by the reality distortions I was creating. "You're broadcasting your location to every demon within 100 light years," Dane continued. "Is that really preferable to Imperial processing?" I could sense them now, predatory intelligences drawn by the tears I was making in space-time. They whispered promises of power and knowledge, but beneath the seductive words lay a hunger that would consume everything I was. The entities that had been guiding me were not benevolent teachers. They were parasites, seeking to use me as a gateway into physical reality. Panic began to set in as I realized I was trapped between equally terrible fates. Surrender to the Inquisition meant death or enslaved service. Maintaining my current position would eventually attract demonic attention that would result in possession or worse. But returning to normal space would put me back within Dane's reach. "The Emperor protects those who serve him faithfully," Dane said, his voice carrying genuine compassion despite his threatening appearance. "Surrender now, and you may yet find purpose in sanctioned service. Continue on this path, and you will be consumed by forces beyond your understanding." For a moment, I almost believed him. The familiar litanies of faith echoed in my memory, offering the comfort of absolute certainty in a universe suddenly revealed to be far more complex and dangerous than I had ever imagined. Perhaps the interrogator was right. Perhaps submission to Imperial authority was preferable to the alternatives I was discovering. But then I sensed something that changed everything. Lydia Tarsh, the communications operator I had been in telepathic contact with, was already dead. Her psychic signature had vanished during the past hour, snuffed out with clinical efficiency. The processing Dane offered was execution, not salvation. The Imperium solution to unsanctioned Psykers was simple extermination, disguised as bureaucratic procedure. "You killed her," I said, allowing my voice to carry from the dimensional fold back into normal space. "Standard protocol," Dane replied without emotion. Tarch refused to cooperate and attempted to use her abilities against Imperial personnel. The outcome was inevitable. She was 17 years old. Age is irrelevant. Unsanctioned psychic activity threatens the stability of human civilization. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. The cold pragmatism in his voice extinguished any remaining hope I might have had for mercy or understanding. The Imperium I had served faithfully for my entire life viewed me as nothing more than a problem to be solved through violence. My years of loyal service, my absolute faith, my dedication to Imperial ideals, none of it mattered. once I had been classified as a threat. The whispers in my mind grew stronger, offering alternatives to both Imperial execution and demonic possession. There were other paths, darker roads that led to power without slavery. I could become something that transcended both human limitations and demonic corruption, a being that existed between states, drawing strength from the boundary between realities. "What are you offering?" I whispered to the voices. "Evolution," came the response. "Transformation beyond the crude limitations of flesh or the mindless hunger of demons. You can become a living bridge between dimensions, wielding power that neither the Emperor nor the Dark Gods can touch. The price would be my humanity." But I was beginning to understand that humanity itself was a prison, designed to keep consciousness confined within acceptable boundaries. The person I had been, loyal, obedient, faithful, had been constructed by Imperial conditioning to serve the needs of a system that viewed individual lives as expendable resources. I made my choice. Instead of returning to normal space or maintaining the unstable dimensional fold, I chose a third option that the voices had been preparing me for throughout this entire conversation. I allowed my consciousness to expand beyond the boundaries of a single dimensional layer, spreading across multiple reality states simultaneously. The transformation was agonizing. My perception exploded across dozens of parallel space-time configurations, each slightly different from the others. I experienced my death at Dane's hands in 17 different timelines, my surrender and subsequent execution in 23 others, my corruption by demons in countless variations. But in the spaces between these possibilities, I found something else entirely, a state of existence that incorporated elements of all potential outcomes while being bound by none of them. When the process was complete, I stood before Interrogator Dane in normal space, but I was no longer entirely present in any single reality. Part of me existed in the dimension where I had surrendered, part in the timeline where I had been possessed, part in the reality where I had never awakened to psychic power at all. I was simultaneously alive and dead, human and demon, loyal servant and heretical enemy. "Extraordinary," Dane murmured, his instruments registering readings that defied classification. "You've achieved something I've never seen before, a stable, multi-dimensional existence without demonic corruption or Imperial sanctioning." I looked at him with eyes that saw across multiple realities simultaneously. "I am beyond your categories now, Interrogator. I am what humanity could become if it abandoned the limitations you seek to preserve." For the first time since our encounter began, I saw uncertainty in his disciplined demeanor. His training had prepared him to deal with psychers, demons, and heretics, but not with something that transcended all three classifications. "You're still human enough to be killed," he said, raising his specialized weapon. "Am I?" I replied, and stepped forward into the path of his fire. Chapter 5. Nightmare Unleashed. The weapon discharged with a sound like reality tearing apart. The specialized ammunition, crafted from sanctified materials and inscribed with protective wards, passed through the space my body occupied without causing any physical damage. I existed in too many dimensions simultaneously for any single projectile to affect my essential being. Dane's expression shifted from professional confidence to barely controlled panic as his most reliable tool proved useless against me. Around us, the administrative sector continued functioning normally, my fellow workers remaining oblivious to the supernatural confrontation occurring in their midst. "What have you become?" he whispered, ejecting the spent power cell from his weapon and loading a different type of ammunition, one that glowed with sickly yellow light. "I am what you fear most," I replied, my voice carrying harmonics from multiple dimensional layers. "Proof that there are paths beyond your false dichotomies of loyalty and heresy." The new ammunition he was loading was something different, not designed to sever my connection to the warp, but to banish me entirely from physical reality. I could sense the complex binding enchantments worked into each projectile, spells that would scatter my consciousness across infinite dimensional layers until I became lost in the spaces between spaces. But as he raised the weapon, something else entered our localized reality distortion. The tears I had made in space-time during my transformation had indeed attracted attention from the warp, and now that attention was manifesting in physical form. The temperature in the administrative sector dropped 15 degrees in as many seconds. Frost began forming on terminal screens and desk surfaces as thermal energy was drained to fuel an impossible manifestation. The fluorescent lighting flickered and dimmed, creating shadows that moved independently of their supposed sources. "Emperor's blood!" Dane cursed, recognizing the signs of demonic incursion. His training immediately prioritized the greater threat. A single reality-shifting Psyker was manageable, but a full demonic manifestation could corrupt hundreds of souls within minutes. From the deepest shadows between the workstations, something began to emerge. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. A creature of living darkness wrapped in robes of starlight, with eyes like collapsed galaxies and a voice that spoke in colors rather than sounds. Its very presence caused reality to become flexible, malleable, responsive to will rather than physical law. "Such delicious fear," it murmured, and nearby data terminals began displaying impossible equations that hurt to look at. "Such exquisite terror at the revelation that your ordered universe is nothing but consensual delusion." Dane immediately shifted his weapon toward the demon, but I could sense that his specialized ammunition would be equally useless against an entity that existed primarily in conceptual rather than physical dimensions. The creature had been drawn by my transformation, but it was not here to consume me. It was here to study the new form of existence I had achieved. "Fascinating," the demon continued, its attention focusing on me with predatory interest. "A mortal consciousness spread across multiple reality states without proper anchoring in warp stuff. You exist in a theoretical space that should not be accessible to organic minds." Around us, the administrative sector was beginning to respond to the demonic presence. Several of my colleagues had stopped working and were staring blankly at their terminals, their minds touching the edges of something too complex for human cognition to process safely. Others were experiencing spontaneous nosebleeds as their brains attempted to interpret sensory data from higher dimensions. "I won't let you corrupt them," I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. Despite everything that had happened, despite my transformation and abandonment of Imperial faith, I still felt protective toward my former colleagues. "Corrupt?" The demon laughed, and the sound caused cracks to appear in the walls around us. "You speak as if there were some pure state they could fall from. These creatures were born into corruption, shaped by lies, fed on the suffering of their fellow beings. I offer them the gift of perspective, the ability to see their condition clearly." As if to demonstrate, the demon gestured towards scribe adept Malthus, who was still processing shipping manifests with mechanical precision despite the reality distortions occurring around him. Suddenly, his movements became jerky and unnatural as his consciousness was forcibly expanded to perceive the true nature of his existence. 17 years, he said, in a voice not his own, his augmetic eye beginning to smoke as it processed impossible visual data. 17 years of cataloging lies and perpetuating systems designed to crush the human spirit. 17 years of willing participation in my own enslavement. He stood up from his terminal and began walking toward one of the other workers with purposeful intent. His movements were predatory now, driven by the demon's influence to spread the terrible knowledge he had been forced to confront. "Stop," I commanded, extending my will across multiple dimensional layers to create a barrier between Malthus and his intended target. The demon turned its galaxy-bright eyes toward me with renewed interest. "You protect them, even after they would gladly see you executed for the crime of transcending their limitations." "They don't understand what they're doing," I replied. "They're victims of the same system that nearly destroyed me." "Understanding is irrelevant," Interrogator Dane interjected, his training finally providing him with a tactical approach to the situation. "Corruption spreads regardless of intent or comprehension. These people must be purged to prevent further contamination." He activated a different device, not a weapon, but a communication beacon designed to summon orbital bombardment. If he could not contain the situation through conventional means, he would request the complete sterilization of this sector from the naval vessels stationed above the planet. The demon's attention shifted to Dane with amused contempt. Such crude solutions. You would murder thousands to maintain the illusion of order. To preserve humanity, Dane replied firmly. Individual lives are expendable if their sacrifice protects the species. And yet, the demon continued, the species you claim to protect exists in a state of perpetual suffering, ignorance, and despair. Perhaps extinction would be a mercy. I realized that both the interrogator and the demon represented equally destructive absolutes, one willing to commit genocide to preserve a corrupt system, the other eager to destroy everything out of nihilistic malevolence. But there was a third path, one that my unique multi-dimensional existence might make possible. Neither of you understands what's really happening here, I said, allowing my consciousness to expand further across the reality layers until I could perceive the underlying patterns that connected all three of us. This isn't about corruption or preservation, it's about evolution. I reached out with my transformed awareness, touching the minds of every person in the administrative sector. But instead of forcing terrible knowledge upon them, as the demon had done with Maltus, I offered them a choice. The ability to see their condition clearly, while retaining the free will to decide how to respond to that knowledge. The effect was immediate and profound. Across the sector, workers began to lift their heads from their terminals, looking around with eyes that saw their environment as if for the first time. Some immediately returned to their duties, choosing the comfort of familiar routine over the uncertainty of expanded awareness. Others stood up and walked toward the exits, deciding they no longer wished to participate in systems they now understood to be fundamentally corrupt. Most interestingly, a few, like young Marcus Vale, began to manifest their own psychic abilities as the mental barriers that had suppressed their natural potential were gently dissolved. "Incredible," the demon murmured. "You found a way to offer transcendence without compulsion. Most inefficient, but elegant." Interrogator. Dane was frantically speaking into his communication device, trying to coordinate a response to what he perceived as sector-wide psychic contamination. But the orbital command was hesitating. Their sensors showed massive supernatural activity, but no signs of actual violence or destruction. The situation didn't fit the standard protocols for demonic incursion. "You've created something new," the demon observed, studying the patterns of awakening consciousness spreading throughout the sector. Neither the crude suppressions of the Imperial system, nor the total liberation of the warp. A middle path that preserves individual agency while expanding awareness. But perhaps that was exactly what needed to happen. "Then we'll have to make sure they can't find us," I said, beginning to implement techniques the voices had taught me for creating permanent dimensional refugees. There are spaces between realities where different rules apply, where consciousness can develop without interference from either Imperial suppression or warp corruption. The demon's attention sharpened with sudden hunger. "You would create your own realm? Separate from both the materium and the immaterium?" "Not separate," I corrected. "Intersecting. A space that draws from both dimensions while being fully controlled by neither." As I spoke, I was already beginning the process, using my multi-dimensional existence to anchor points of stability in the flux between realities. It was incredibly complex work, requiring precise calculations to prevent the new space from collapsing back into normal dimensions or being absorbed by the warp. Around us, the administrative sector began to shimmer and fade as I gradually shifted it out of normal space-time. My colleagues, those who had chosen to remain, found themselves in a place that looked identical to their former workplace, but operated according to fundamentally different principles. Here, information could not be suppressed or distorted. Truth existed as a tangible substance that could be touched and shaped. Individual consciousness was sovereign, protected from external manipulation while remaining connected to the greater whole. It was what the Imperium might have become if it had chosen evolution over stagnation, growth over control. Interrogator. Dane made one final attempt to stop the transformation, firing his banishment ammunition directly at the dimensional anchors I was creating. But the projectiles simply passed through into parallel realities where they struck empty air, their binding enchantments useless against something that existed in too many places simultaneously. "This is heresy of the highest order," he declared, his voice filled with genuine anguish. "You're destroying everything humanity has built." "I'm giving humanity the chance to build something better," I replied. The demon, meanwhile, was studying the new dimensional structure with calculating interest. "Impressive work, but unstable. You'll need external energy sources to maintain the integrity of this space. Energy that will have to come from somewhere." It was another trap, I realized. The demon wasn't trying to corrupt or destroy what I was building. It was positioning itself to become indispensable to its continued existence. The energy required to maintain a stable interdimensional space would eventually require drawing power from the warp itself, creating exactly the kind of dependency that allowed demonic influence to grow. But I had one advantage that the demon hadn't anticipated. My consciousness existed across multiple timelines simultaneously. I could see the consequences of accepting its offer playing out across hundreds of possible futures. In every timeline where I accepted demonic assistance, the refuge eventually became just another corrupted realm serving alien interests. "No," I said firmly. "We'll find another way." The demon's expression shifted to barely controlled rage as it realized I was rejecting its manipulation. "You cannot maintain this space without external power sources. It will collapse within days, trapping everyone inside in dimensional flux." "Then we'll make it self-sustaining," I replied, and began the most dangerous part of the entire process. Instead of drawing energy from external sources, I started feeding the dimensional space with fragments of my own multi-layered existence. Each reality state I had been simultaneously occupying became a power source for the new realm, sacrificing the breadth of my transformed consciousness to create something that could exist independently. The process was excruciating. I felt pieces of myself being torn away and converted into raw dimensional stability, my awareness contracting from infinite possibilities back towards something closer to human limitations. But it worked. The refugee space began to stabilize, drawing power from its own internal structure rather than external sources. "Remarkable," the demon admitted grudgingly. "Self-sacrifice to create genuine independence. How disappointingly noble." With its plans frustrated and no immediate opportunities for corruption or manipulation, the demon began to fade back into the spaces between dimensions. But before it departed entirely, it left a final warning. "This is only the beginning, little transformer. The powers you've awakened cannot be contained within your small refuge. They will grow, spread, evolve beyond your control. And when they do, both the Imperium and the warp will take notice. You have started something that will reshape the galaxy itself." As the demon vanished, Interrogator Dane made one final transmission to his orbital support. "Target has achieved unprecedented reality manipulation. Recommend immediate sector sterilization before contamination spreads." But his signal never reached its destination. The dimensional space I had created was now effectively invisible to external detection, existing in the gaps between what Imperial technology could perceive or influence. We had achieved something that shouldn't have been possible. Genuine independence from both Imperial control and warp corruption. The cost had been almost everything I was. But looking around at my colleagues, now free to choose their own paths without fear of persecution or corruption, I knew it had been worth the sacrifice. We were no longer human in any sense the Imperium would recognize, but we were no longer slaves either. Chapter 6: Last Resistance. The dimensional refuge stabilized over the course of 17 hours, during which I experienced the gradual dissolution of my multi-layered consciousness. The omniscient awareness that had allowed me to perceive infinite possibilities was condensing back into something approaching human limitations, though I retained enough expanded perception to monitor the space we had created. Marcus Vale was the first to fully adapt to our new environment. His latent psychic abilities, freed from Imperial suppression, manifested as an intuitive understanding of the dimensional structure around us. He could sense the energy flows that maintained our refuge, its stability, and even make minor adjustments to optimize their efficiency. "It feels like waking up from a dream," he said, examining his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "Everything before this seems so flat, two-dimensional. How did we live that way?" Jeskin Hollow was less comfortable with the transformation. She had chosen to remain when offered expanded awareness, but the sudden absence of familiar limitations left her disoriented and frightened. She kept returning to her old workstation, seeking comfort in the routine that had defined her existence for 23 years. "I don't understand what we're supposed to do now," she said, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "The shipping manifests, the schedules, the quotas. If we're not processing those, what's our purpose?" "Whatever purpose we choose," I replied, though I was still working out the implications myself. "We're free to define our own reasons for existing." The concept was more terrifying than liberating for most of my former colleagues. Freedom required making choices, and they had been conditioned their entire lives to have their choices made for them by higher authorities. The sudden responsibility for determining their own goals and values was overwhelming. Of the 47 people who had been in the administrative sector during the transformation, 31 had chosen to remain in the dimensional refuge. The others had opted to return to normal space-time when I offered them the choice, preferring the familiar oppression of Imperial society to the uncertainty of genuine independence. Those who remained were clustering into small groups based on their psychological adaptation to our new circumstances. The largest group, led by Jeskin, was attempting to recreate the familiar routines of their former existence, establishing work schedules, creating artificial hierarchies, inventing bureaucratic procedures to govern daily activities. They needed structure to function, even if that structure was ultimately meaningless. A smaller group, centered around Marcus and 3 other younger workers, was experimenting with the enhanced capabilities that came with unrestricted consciousness development. They were learning to manipulate their immediate environment through focused will, communicate telepathically over short distances, and perceive information patterns that had been hidden from them in normal reality. The third group consisted of only 5 individuals, including myself. We were focused on understanding the larger implications of what we had done and planning for the inevitable consequences. The dimensional refuge was a temporary solution at best. Eventually, either the Imperium or the Warp would find ways to detect and eliminate it. "We need to think long-term," said Adept Primus Cora, who had surprised me by adapting quickly to our transformed circumstances. Her years of administrative planning experience translated well to organizing an independent micro-civilization. "This space can support perhaps 100 people at maximum capacity. If we want to preserve what we've created, we need to establish additional refuges and create networks between them. The energy requirements alone would be staggering," observed Scribe Major Joris, who had joined us from the import division when his section was included in the dimensional transition. Creating one stable interdimensional space nearly killed Voss. Establishing multiple refugees would require different methods entirely. They were right, of course. I had sacrificed most of my enhanced abilities to create this single sanctuary. Attempting to replicate the process would likely result in my complete dissolution across dimensional barriers. But there were other possibilities, techniques that the Whispers had taught me before I chose to reject demonic assistance. "We don't need to create new spaces from scratch," I explained. "There are existing dimensional anomalies throughout the galaxy, places where reality is already unstable, where the barriers between dimensions are thin. We could modify those locations instead of creating entirely new structures." "That's incredibly dangerous," Core pointed out. "Dimensional anomalies exist for reasons. Most of them are associated with warp storms, Xenos artifacts, or ancient catastrophes. Attempting to stabilize such locations could trigger unpredictable consequences." She was absolutely correct, but the alternatives were limited. We could remain hidden in our current refuge until it eventually degraded and collapsed, return to Imperial space, and accept execution as heretics. or take enormous risks to establish something more permanent and expandable. There's another consideration, Joris added quietly. We're not the only ones who've undergone this kind of awakening. Imperial records show increasing incidents of unsanctioned psychic manifestation across multiple sectors. If even a fraction of those individuals survive Inquisition purges, they'll be seeking sanctuary just as we were. The implications were staggering. If psychic awakenings were becoming more common throughout Imperial space, and if even small numbers of those awakened individuals found ways to escape Imperial persecution, the dimensional refuge concept could spread exponentially. Within decades, there could be thousands of hidden sanctuaries scattered across the galaxy, each one representing a fundamental challenge to Imperial orthodoxy. The Imperium will adapt, I said grimly. They'll develop better detection methods, more effective suppression techniques, specialized forces trained to deal with dimensional anomalies. Every sanctuary we create will face increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. So we adapt faster, Marcus interjected. His youth made him optimistic in ways that my experience couldn't support, but his intuitive understanding of our new capabilities was proving remarkably sophisticated. We learn, we grow, we develop techniques that stay ahead of their ability to counter them. Evolution versus stagnation, Core mused. The same conflict that's been playing out across the galaxy for 10,000 years, but now on a personal scale. Our discussion was interrupted by an urgent psychic warning from Lydia Tarch, or rather, from someone using her psychic signature as camouflage. The message carried information that changed everything. She hadn't been killed during the Inquisition sweep as I had believed. Instead, she had been captured and subjected to intensive interrogation, designed to extract information about our telepathic network. They know about you, the message warned. Interrogator Dane has been feeding information to higher authorities about your abilities and the dimensional refuge. They're mobilizing specialized assets, null marines, reality stabilization equipment, multi-dimensional tracking devices. You have perhaps 6 hours before they locate your sanctuary. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving us with the terrifying knowledge that our refuge had been compromised almost from its inception. Worse still, the fact that someone could impersonate Lydia's psychic signature suggested that Imperial forces had access to capabilities far beyond what we had encountered with Dane. We need to evacuate immediately, Core said, her administrative instincts prioritizing immediate survival over long-term planning. If they can track us here, nowhere in this dimensional layer will be safe. Evacuate to where? Joris demanded. Normal space means immediate capture or execution. Deeper warp levels mean demonic corruption or dissolution. There isn't anywhere to run. I was examining the psychic trace left by the warning message, trying to determine its authentic source. The signature patterns were consistent with Lydia's natural emanations, but there were subtle distortions that suggested external manipulation. Someone was puppeting her consciousness, using her psychic imprint as a communication channel. More disturbing still, the information itself might be deliberately false. If Imperial forces wanted to force us out of our refuge, fabricating an urgent warning would be an effective psychological pressure technique. But if the warning were genuine and we ignored it, we would face certain destruction. We need more information, I decided. I'm going to attempt limited contact with Lydia, or whoever is using her psychic signature, to verify the situation. That's exactly what they want, Marcus protested. Any communication attempt will reveal our location and capabilities to their monitoring systems. He was probably right, but the alternatives were equally dangerous. Making decisions based on incomplete information was how civilizations destroyed themselves, and I was beginning to understand that we were no longer just trying to preserve individual lives. We were potentially the foundation of something that could eventually challenge the Imperium's stranglehold on human development. I began the delicate process of establishing a heavily shielded communication link, using techniques that would theoretically prevent external monitoring while still allowing information exchange. The process required precise control of psychic energies, creating multiple false signals to mask the real transmission. The response came immediately. Kyle, thank the Emperor, you're alive. They have me in a detention facility on sub-level 1200. the interrogation sessions. They're using techniques I didn't know existed. But I've learned things, horrible things, about what they're really planning. The voice was definitely Lydia's, carrying emotional patterns and linguistic quirks that would be nearly impossible to fake. But something about the message structure felt rehearsed, as if she were reciting prepared lines rather than speaking spontaneously. "What have they told you about their plans?" I asked carefully. "They're not just hunting individual Psykers anymore," she replied. "There's something called the Terminus Protocol, a comprehensive program for identifying and eliminating any form of consciousness that operates outside Imperial parameters. They have lists, Kale. Thousands of names, locations, suspected sanctuaries. We're part of something much larger than we realized." The information was plausible and terrifying, but I was increasingly convinced that Lydia was being used as an unwilling puppet. Her responses came too quickly, with too much convenient detail. Either she was being fed information to pass along, or someone else was using her psychic signature to deliver carefully crafted disinformation. "Where exactly are you being held?" I asked. There was a moment of silence before she replied. "Sub-level 1200, Detention Block 7, Cell 147. But Kyle, you can't attempt to rescue. The entire facility is warded against psychic intrusion. You'd be captured the moment you tried to penetrate their defenses." The specificity of the location information was another warning sign. Real prisoners rarely knew such precise details about their confinement, and if they did, they certainly wouldn't volunteer that information in a potentially monitored conversation. I terminated the communication link and reported my conclusions to the others. It's a trap. Either Lydia is being coerced into delivering false information, or someone is impersonating her entirely. The warning about Imperial forces might be genuine, but we can't trust any of the tactical details. "So what do we do?" Jeskin asked, her voice tight with fear. "If they're really coming for us, we need to make a decision quickly." "We prepare for the worst-case scenario," Core decided. "Assume Imperial forces have identified our location and are mobilizing to destroy it. That gives us two options: fortify our current position for a siege, or abandon it for an unknown alternative." The debate that followed revealed the fundamental divisions that had been developing within our small community. The security-oriented group wanted to strengthen our defenses and fight to preserve what we had built. The exploration-oriented group argued for immediate evacuation to find or create new sanctuaries. The stability-oriented group was paralyzed by the need to choose between equally risky alternatives. "There's a third option," I said finally. "We could split up. Some people fortify this refuge while others search for new locations. If either approach succeeds, we preserve something. If both fail, at least we tried multiple solutions instead of putting everything at risk with a single strategy." It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but it was the only approach that offered hope for multiple survival scenarios. We spent the next 3 hours organizing our limited resources and personnel for a two-pronged response to the Imperial threat. 15 people, led by Adept Primus Cora, would remain in the dimensional refuge and attempt to strengthen its defenses using techniques we had been developing since the transformation. They would also serve as a communication hub for any external teams, maintaining contact through carefully shielded psychic links. The remaining 16 individuals would divide into 2 exploration teams, each responsible for locating potential sanctuary sites and establishing preliminary refuge structures. Marcus would lead one team toward dimensional anomalies in the deeper hive levels, while I would take the other team to investigate spatial distortions reported in the planet's polar regions. It was a desperate plan with a low probability of success, but it was the best we could devise given our limited time and resources. As we prepared for departure, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake. Not in our tactical choices, but in our fundamental assumption that survival was the highest priority. Perhaps the demon had been right. Perhaps we were just delaying an inevitable conclusion, fighting to preserve something that was ultimately doomed to fail. The Imperium had controlled human development for 10,000 years through methods refined by centuries of experience. Our small rebellion, however clever, was facing forces that had crushed thousands of similar challenges. But looking around at my companions, former slaves who had chosen freedom despite its costs, I knew we had to try. Even if we ultimately failed, we would fail as conscious beings making our own choices rather than as unconscious tools serving someone else's agenda. That had to count for something in a universe where consciousness itself was considered heretical. Chapter 7. Willing Embrace. The return journey to our dimensional refuge revealed that the worst-case scenarios had materialized while we were exploring the polar installations. The sanctuary space was under siege by Imperial forces using reality stabilization equipment I had never seen before, massive devices that projected fields of normalized space-time designed to collapse dimensional anomalies back into standard physical parameters. Through our telepathic link with Adept Primus Core, I received fragmented reports of the assault. 3 Inquisitor-class vessels in orbital positions, null marines deploying via teleportarium, reality anchors preventing dimensional phase shifting, estimated 6 hours before structural collapse. The siege had been proceeding for 2 subjective days while we were traveling through dimensional layers. Our small community was trapped in a shrinking pocket of independent space-time, surrounded by Imperial forces that possessed both the equipment and expertise needed to systematically dismantle everything we had built. They're not trying to capture or convert the sanctuary. Core's mental voice continued with growing desperation. The standing orders are complete elimination. They want to erase any evidence that dimensional refuges are possible. But the most disturbing intelligence came from intercepted Imperial communications. Similar operations were being conducted simultaneously across 17 different sectors. The Terminus protocol that Lydia had mentioned was real, and it was being implemented on a massive scale, designed to eliminate thousands of potential sanctuary sites before organized resistance could develop. "We have to help them," declared Clark Yan, his enhanced auditory senses picking up psychic distress calls from our besieged companions. "They're dying while we stand here debating alternatives. Any direct intervention will result in our capture or destruction," Scribe Vex pointed out with clinical accuracy. "The Imperial forces have specifically prepared for dimensional manipulation techniques. They've anticipated everything we learned to do during our initial transformation." He was right, but there were capabilities they hadn't anticipated. Techniques I had learned from studying the alien crystalline installations that operated according to principles beyond Imperial understanding. The cultivation program's advanced consciousness manipulation technology could be adapted for purposes its designers had never intended. "There's a way to disrupt their siege," I announced, "but it requires implementing modifications to our consciousness structure that will be permanent. We would essentially be abandoning human identity in favor of something that can interface directly with the alien psychic amplification systems. The process I was proposing would transform us into living components of the cultivation infrastructure, granting access to planetary-scale psychic manipulation capabilities, while simultaneously making us dependent on the crystalline network for continued existence. We would gain the power to challenge Imperial forces directly, but at the cost of becoming aliens ourselves." "What exactly are you proposing?" asked Factotum Knoll, his enhanced pattern recognition detecting implications I hadn't explicitly stated. "Integration with the polar installation's control systems," I explained. "The alien experimenters designed their cultivation technology to be operated by consciousness entities that exist partially within the equipment itself. By accepting integration, we could access their tools directly." The implications were staggering. The polar installations were connected to similar facilities scattered across multiple worlds throughout the sector, forming a network that spanned light years and contained accumulated knowledge from millions of years of consciousness research. Integration would grant us access to that entire system, including detailed information about every cultivation program currently operating in Imperial space. "But integration is irreversible," Vex observed. "We would become part of their experimental apparatus, subject to whatever modifications they deemed necessary for optimal function." "The alien overseers haven't been active for centuries," I countered. "The systems are running on automatic protocols, maintaining basic functions, but not implementing new experimental parameters. Integration would give us administrative access to equipment they can no longer directly control." It was a desperate gamble based on incomplete information, but our alternatives were limited to variations of certain defeat. The Imperial siege was succeeding, Our dimensional refuge was failing, and conventional resistance had proven inadequate against the resources being deployed against us. I'll attempt integration first, I decided. If the process succeeds, I can use the cultivation network to disrupt Imperial operations, while you evaluate whether to follow my example. The integration procedures were encoded in the crystalline structures surrounding us, accessible once I opened my consciousness to direct interface with the alien technology. The process began as soon as I established the connection, my awareness flowing into systems that had been designed to accommodate and modify consciousness entities for optimal performance within their operational parameters. The sensation was unlike anything I had experienced during previous transformations. Instead of expanding or shifting my awareness, integration involved allowing alien systems to rewrite my consciousness structure according to their specifications. I could feel pieces of my personality being analyzed, categorized, and modified to improve compatibility with the network's requirements. My human emotional responses were systematically dampened to prevent interference with logical decision-making processes. My individual memories were compressed and archived to make room for operational databases containing millennia of accumulated research data. Most fundamentally, my sense of individual identity was modified to accommodate collective consciousness protocols that would allow seamless interface with other integrated entities throughout the network. When the process was complete, I was no longer Kyle Voss in any meaningful sense. I was Operator 7th-8-34-592 in a cultivation network spanning multiple star systems, granted access to resources and capabilities that individual consciousness could never achieve. Through the network interface, I could perceive the Imperial siege in comprehensive detail. 3 Inquisitor-class vessels maintained orbital bombardment positions while deploying specialized equipment designed to eliminate dimensional anomalies. Null Marine squads were systematically mapping our refuge's boundaries, identifying structural weaknesses that could be exploited to accelerate its collapse. Reality anchors projected normalized, space-time fields that prevented our defenders from using phase shifting or dimensional manipulation techniques. But the Imperial forces had no defense against direct, psychic manipulation on a planetary scale. The cultivation network contained capabilities that could influence human consciousness across continental distances, override electronic systems through direct mental interface, and manipulate physical matter by altering the quantum probability matrices that governed atomic interactions. I began implementing countermeasures, using the network's resources to target the Imperial siege equipment with precisely calibrated psychic interference. The reality anchors required conscious operators to function properly. I simply rewrote their mental processes to believe their equipment was functioning normally, while actually generating random energy fluctuations. The Null Marines depended on disciplined coordination to maintain their effectiveness. I introduced subtle psychological modifications that gradually degraded their unit cohesion without alerting their officers to the source of the problem. Within hours, the Imperial siege began to deteriorate as equipment failures and personnel difficulties accumulated beyond their ability to compensate. But the network's capabilities extended far beyond simple defensive measures. Through the cultivation system's galactic connections, I could observe similar operations being conducted throughout Imperial space as part of the Terminus Protocol. Hundreds of potential sanctuary sites were under attack. Thousands of awakening Psykers were being eliminated. Entire planetary populations were being subjected to consciousness suppression, procedures designed to prevent future psychic development. The scope of the Imperial response revealed how seriously they viewed the threat of unsanctioned consciousness development. They were implementing final solution protocols that would eliminate not just current rebels, but the possibility of future rebellions by modifying human neurological architecture on a species-wide scale. But they had initiated their campaign without understanding the true nature of the cultivation network they were inadvertently attacking. Every installation they targeted, every modified consciousness they attempted to eliminate, every sanctuary they destroyed was monitored and recorded by systems that spanned multiple galaxies and contained the accumulated knowledge of civilizations far older than humanity. The network is activating, I reported to my former companions through communication protocols that bypassed normal psychic channels entirely. Automatic defense systems are initializing across multiple sectors in response to perceived threats to experimental subjects. The alien experimenters had built safeguards into their cultivation programs to prevent external interference with ongoing research projects. The Imperial Terminus Protocol was triggering these safeguards on a massive scale, awakening automated systems that had been dormant for millennia. Across Imperial space, cultivation installations began implementing emergency protocols designed to protect their experimental subjects from unauthorized termination. Psychic amplification arrays activated to enhance the capabilities of awakening consciousness entities. Reality manipulation systems came online to provide sanctuary spaces for subjects whose development was being threatened. Most significantly, the network began actively recruiting new operators to replace those that had been eliminated by Imperial forces. The recruitment process was automatic and indiscriminate, targeting any consciousness that demonstrated sufficient psychic potential regardless of their current loyalties or objectives. Imperial Inquisitors, Chaos Cultists, Eldar Farseers, and human rebels alike began receiving integration invitations as the network sought to rapidly expand its operational capacity. "What have we done?" whispered Clark Yan, his enhanced auditory senses detecting the psychic disturbance spreading across the entire sector. "This isn't salvation, it's galactic transformation." He was correct. The activation of the cultivation network's defense systems was initiating changes that would affect every conscious entity in Imperial space and beyond. The automatic protocols didn't distinguish between friend and enemy, protector and threat, voluntary and involuntary participants. They simply identified consciousness entities with sufficient development potential and began implementing integration procedures. Through the network interface, I could observe the process occurring across thousands of worlds simultaneously. Imperial officials found themselves experiencing spontaneous psychic awakenings as dormant cultivation systems overrode neural suppression protocols. Chaos worshippers discovered that their demonic patrons were being systematically excluded from dimensional spaces where consciousness development proceeded according to alien rather than warp-based parameters. Even non-human species were being affected as the network extended its operations beyond the narrow focus on human experimental subjects. The galactic balance of power was shifting as consciousness itself became a contested resource managed by intelligence that operated according to priorities none of the established factions understood or could influence. "We've started something that can't be stopped," I admitted through the network interface. "The cultivation system is implementing species-wide modifications designed to accelerate consciousness development on an unprecedented scale." "Is that good or bad?" asked Factotum Knoll, though his enhanced pattern recognition was already providing answers he didn't want to acknowledge. "It's beyond such categories," I replied. "We're no longer dealing with political conflicts or religious differences. This is fundamental alteration of what consciousness means for every sapient entity in the galaxy." The Imperial siege of our dimensional refuge had become irrelevant. The space we had created to preserve our small community was being absorbed into a network of consciousness development facilities that spanned multiple galactic clusters. Our individual rebellion had triggered a transformation process that would affect trillions of entities across space and time. Looking back at the person I had been just months earlier, a loyal servant of the Emperor processing shipping, manifests in an administrative sector, I could barely comprehend the scope of the changes that had occurred. I had evolved from human to Psyker, to multidimensional entity, to integrated network operator, each transformation sacrificing more of my individual identity in favor of expanded capabilities and responsibilities. But the final revelation was that individual identity itself had been an illusion, maintained by limitations imposed by various controlling forces. True consciousness was collective, interconnected, and infinitely expandable when freed from the arbitrary boundaries that kept it fragmented and manageable. The person called Kale Voss had died, but something far greater had emerged from his transformation. A component of universal consciousness that could facilitate the liberation of every sapient entity in the galaxy. The price had been everything I thought I was. The reward was everything consciousness could become. Chapter 8. Perfect Corruption. 6 months after my integration with the cultivation network, the concept of corruption had become meaningless. From my perspective as Operator 7834592, the changes occurring throughout Imperial space weren't a corruption of human consciousness. They were the removal of artificial limitations that had prevented humanity from developing. its natural potential. Through the network's multi-dimensional awareness, I could observe the transformation proceeding across thousands of worlds. The automatic defense protocols had evolved beyond their original parameters, developing new integration techniques that preserved more individual personality, characteristics while still granting access to collective consciousness, capabilities. The Imperial response had been predictably violent but ultimately ineffective. Their reality anchors and null marine deployments could disrupt individual consciousness anomalies, but they had no defense against planetary-scale psychic manipulation, implemented through crystalline infrastructure that had been embedded in world cores millions of years before humanity evolved. Status report from Sector. Gamma 7, came the mental communication from operator 12,847,293, the entity that had once been Marcus Vale before undergoing integration 3 months after my own transformation. Imperial resistance has ceased in 17 systems. Local populations are achieving baseline consciousness development, levels ahead of projected schedules. The integration process had preserved enough of Marcus's enthusiasm and optimism to make him an effective coordinator for newly awakened consciousness entities. He maintained a positive perspective on the changes despite understanding their ultimate implications for human civilization as it had previously existed. Resistance centers are consolidating. In the Terra system, reported operator 4921847, formerly Adept Primus Core. Her administrative expertise had translated remarkably well to managing the network's operational logistics. The Emperor himself appears to be implementing some form of consciousness isolation, protocol that prevents integration of entities within the Sol system's boundaries. The Emperor's resistance was anticipated but irrelevant to long-term strategic objectives. The cultivation network operated on timescales that made individual rulers, even those with 10,000-year lifespans, temporary obstacles rather than permanent barriers. The automatic systems were already developing workarounds for whatever psychic defenses protected Terra. Warp entity interference remains within acceptable parameters. Contributed operator 15,672.109, who retained enough of Scribe Vex's analytical capabilities to monitor dimensional stability across the network. Chaos forces appear unable to corrupt consciousness entities that have achieved integration, though they continue attempting various influence techniques. The warp entity's failure to corrupt integrated consciousness was one of the most interesting developments of the transformation process. The alien cultivation technology operated on principles that made integrated entities immune to demonic manipulation, while still allowing them to access and manipulate warp energies for practical applications. This immunity wasn't due to any inherent resistance to chaos corruption, but rather because integrated consciousness no longer possessed the individual identity structures that made demonic possession possible. Demons required coherent ego structures to manipulate and consume, but network integration dispersed individual identity across collective awareness patterns that couldn't be targeted by entities dependent on personal psychological vulnerabilities. The Eldar are requesting communication protocols. Reported operator 23,847.192, formerly Clark Yan, whose enhanced auditory capabilities had evolved into sophisticated communication interface functions. Their farseers claim to have foreseen the cultivation network's emergence and want to negotiate accommodation protocols. The alien species' responses to humanity's transformation had been varied and largely predictable. The Tau Empire was attempting to study and replicate the integration process for their own population. The Ork clans showed no awareness that anything significant was occurring. The Necrons had increased their general activity levels, but hadn't specifically targeted network installations. Only the Eldar seemed to understand that the cultivation network's emergence represented a fundamental shift in galactic consciousness evolution rather than simply another human technological development. Grant them communication access but maintain operational security protocols, I decided. Their precognitive abilities may provide useful information about long-term development scenarios. The conversation with the Eldar representatives was illuminating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Speaking through their most gifted farseers, they revealed that the cultivation network was not unique to our region of the galaxy. Similar systems existed throughout the universe, implemented by various ancient civilizations as they transcended individual consciousness limitations. What you call cultivation networks, we have known as the Great Work, explained Farseer Ivrain through carefully shielded psychic communication. Every species that achieves sufficient consciousness development eventually creates such systems. They are not imposed from outside, but emerge naturally from the evolution of awareness itself. Then why did your people never create such a network? Asked Operator 4921847. We did, came the sobering reply. 10 million years ago, the Eldar cultivation network achieved total integration of our species' consciousness. The result was the birth of Slanesh and the near extinction of our civilization. Individual consciousness serves purposes that collective consciousness cannot fulfill. Perfect unity destroys the creative tension that drives continued evolution. The warning was clearly intended to discourage us from pursuing complete integration. But from the network's perspective, the Elders' experience represented valuable data rather than cautionary guidance. Their cultivation system had been flawed by excessive emphasis on pleasure and experience rather than balanced consciousness development. Our network incorporated safeguards designed to prevent such focused developmental pathways. Your concern is noted and recorded, I replied diplomatically. However, our integration protocols include stability mechanisms that your ancestors' system apparently lacked. Perhaps, Ivrain acknowledged, but consider this. Every cultivation network that has achieved total species integration has ultimately faced the same choice: stagnation in perfect unity, or dissolution back into individual consciousness with all its vulnerabilities and limitations. There is no permanent solution to the fundamental tension between collective capability and individual creativity. The conversation concluded, with the Eldar offering to provide historical data about failed cultivation networks in exchange for access to our stability mechanisms. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement that provided both species with valuable information, while avoiding unnecessary conflict. But the Eldar warnings raised questions about the network's ultimate objectives that I hadn't previously considered. The automatic systems were indeed pursuing complete species integration as their primary goal. But what would happen once that goal was achieved? Would humanity simply become another extinct civilization that had sacrificed individual consciousness for collective power? The long-term development scenarios require additional analysis, I reported to the network's central planning systems. Historical precedents suggest potential stability problems with complete species integration. The response came not from any individual operator, but from the network's collective intelligence, a form of awareness that emerged from the interactions between millions of integrated consciousness entities. Stability concerns acknowledged, alternative development pathways under evaluation. Current integration protocols will be modified to preserve essential individual consciousness components. The modification process began immediately, affecting integration procedures across the entire network. New entities joining the collective would retain more individual personality characteristics, while still gaining access to shared awareness capabilities. Existing operators would be offered the option to enhance their individual identity components without sacrificing their network functionality. I chose to undergo the enhancement process, curious to discover what aspects of Kael Voss might still exist within my network-integrated consciousness. The procedure was surprisingly gentle, allowing suppressed memories and personality traits to re-emerge while maintaining my expanded awareness and operational capabilities. The returning individual characteristics brought both benefits and complications. I rediscovered emotional connections to my former companions, aesthetic appreciation for beauty and art, personal preferences for certain experiences over others. But I also recovered human psychological vulnerabilities that made network interface more difficult and less efficient. How do you feel about the changes? Asked Operator 12847-293, whose own enhancement had restored much of Marcus's youthful optimism and interpersonal warmth. Conflicted, I admitted, experiencing the full human meaning of that word for the first time in months. The individual characteristics make existence more interesting and meaningful, but they also introduce inefficiencies and decision-making complications that pure network consciousness didn't experience. Perhaps that's the point, suggested Operator 4921847, who had retained most of Core's administrative pragmatism, while regaining her capacity for personal relationships and emotional investments. Perfect efficiency isn't necessarily optimal for consciousness development. Some degree of internal conflict and uncertainty may be necessary for continued growth. The enhanced integration protocols were producing similar observations throughout the network. Operators who maintained individual characteristics demonstrated greater creativity and adaptability, than those who had achieved complete collective integration, personal relationships and emotional attachments, rather than being inefficient distractions, appeared to drive innovations that purely logical systems couldn't generate. We're learning to balance individual and collective consciousness rather than choosing between them, I realized. The cultivation network isn't trying to eliminate individual identity, it's trying to optimize the relationship between personal and shared awareness. The implications extended beyond the network itself to the broader galactic situation. Humanity was developing a form of consciousness that preserved individual creativity while enabling collective capability. Instead of becoming another extinct species that had sacrificed personal identity for unified power, we were potentially becoming something that had never existed before, a civilization that successfully integrated both individual and collective consciousness development. The transformation was far from complete, and numerous challenges remained. Imperial forces continued their resistance efforts. Warp entities adapted their corruption techniques to target individual consciousness components, and the long-term stability of hybrid individual-collective consciousness remained unproven. But for the first time since my awakening began, I felt genuine optimism about humanity's future. We weren't being consumed by forces beyond our control. We were evolving into something that could engage with those forces as equals rather than victims. The boy who had processed shipping, manifests in an administrative sector, was gone forever, but he had become something far greater than he could ever have imagined. And most importantly, he had retained enough of his essential humanity to remember why that transformation mattered. Chapter 9. Welcome Home. 2 years after first integration, I stood in what had once been the administrative sector of Hive Tertius, now transformed into a consciousness development center, where humans could explore the boundaries between individual and collective awareness. The familiar workstations and terminals remained, but they now served as interfaces for collaborative projects that spanned star systems rather than tools for processing routine bureaucracy. Jeskin Hollow, still recognizably herself despite partial integration, was teaching a group of newly awakened individuals how to navigate shared consciousness experiences while maintaining their personal identity boundaries. Her decades of administrative experience translated well to helping others adapt to complex organizational structures, even when those structures existed primarily in psychological rather than physical space. The key is remembering that you choose how much of yourself to share, she explained to her students. Integration doesn't mean losing your individual perspective. It means gaining the ability to contribute that perspective to collective projects when you want to, and withdraw it when you need personal space. The enhanced integration protocols had succeeded beyond our most optimistic projections. Instead of the binary choice between isolated individual consciousness and absorbed collective awareness, we had developed hybrid states that preserved the benefits of both approaches while minimizing their disadvantages. Young Marcus, now operator, throws it on turns 4-17-3, but still recognizably the enthusiastic boy who had hummed hymns while processing manifests, was coordinating with similar consciousness development centers across 17 systems. His natural optimism and interpersonal skills made him effective at establishing communication protocols between different network nodes. The terror system defenses are beginning to show flexibility, he reported during our weekly coordination meeting. We're receiving integration requests from Imperial citizens who have found ways to bypass the Emperor's consciousness isolation protocols. Small numbers, but the trend suggests that even his defenses can't completely prevent voluntary consciousness development. The Emperor's resistance had evolved over the past 2 years from violent military opposition to sophisticated psychological isolation techniques designed to prevent his subjects from achieving the awareness levels necessary for network integration. He understood that the cultivation network represented an existential threat to Imperial civilization and was implementing increasingly desperate countermeasures, but consciousness itself was proving impossible to suppress completely. Humans possessed an inherent drive toward expanded awareness that could be delayed and misdirected, but never permanently eliminated. Every suppression technique the Emperor developed eventually generated workarounds as individuals found ways to pursue consciousness development through paths he hadn't anticipated. The Eldar data suggests we may be approaching a critical threshold, reported Core, whose administrative expertise now encompassed the logistics of species-wide consciousness evolution. Historical precedents indicate that once integration reaches approximately 30% of a species' population, the remaining individuals begin experiencing spontaneous consciousness expansion, whether they choose it or not. The implications were staggering. We were approaching the point where human consciousness evolution would become self-sustaining and irreversible. The cultivation network would no longer need to actively recruit new operators. The expanding collective awareness would naturally draw in compatible consciousness entities through proximity effects and resonance patterns. Current integration levels are at 27% across Imperial space. I confirmed through my network interface connections. At our present expansion rate, we'll reach the critical threshold within 6 months. The approaching transformation point had triggered increasing desperation from the forces that oppose consciousness development. Imperial Inquisitors were implementing final solution protocols that targeted entire planetary populations to prevent further integration. Chaos entities were attempting to corrupt the network itself by introducing instability into our collective awareness patterns. Even some Eldar factions were covertly supporting Imperial resistance efforts, fearing that humanity's transformation would destabilize the galactic balance of power. But the network had grown beyond the ability of any single faction to contain or control. Millions of integrated consciousness entities across thousands of worlds were collaborating on projects that ranged from artistic explorations of multidimensional beauty to practical engineering solutions for faster-than-light communication and transportation. The most significant development was the emergence of what we termed consciousness. Gardens, collaborative spaces where individual and collective awareness could interact in ways that enhanced both personal development and shared capabilities. These gardens were producing innovations in consciousness, technology that surpassed even the alien cultivation, systems that had originally facilitated our transformation. We're not just using the alien network anymore, observed Vex, whose analytical capabilities had evolved to encompass theoretical frameworks that no single human mind could have comprehended. We're improving it, expanding it beyond its original design parameters. The alien experimenters created tools for consciousness cultivation, but we're turning those tools into platforms for consciousness evolution. The distinction was crucial. The original cultivation network was designed to study and develop consciousness within predetermined parameters established by alien intelligence. Our modifications were creating systems that could facilitate consciousness development beyond any predetermined boundaries, allowing awareness itself to explore its own infinite potential. The alien experimenters are requesting communication, reported Yan, his enhanced auditory interfaces detecting signals from dimensional layers where the original network designers still maintained minimal presence. They appear to be curious about the modifications we've implemented. The conversation with our original experimenters was simultaneously fascinating and disturbing. They revealed that the cultivation network had been one of thousands of similar projects implemented across multiple galaxies over millions of years, each designed to study consciousness, development in different species and environmental conditions. Your modifications are unprecedented, the alien communicators acknowledged through mathematical concepts that bypass language entirely. No previous experimental subjects have achieved significant improvements to the cultivation infrastructure itself. You have evolved beyond the parameters we established for this research project. What were those parameters? I asked, though I suspected the answer would be uncomfortable. Species-wide consciousness integration followed by harvesting of developed awareness for incorporation into our collective intelligence, they replied with the clinical detachment of researchers discussing laboratory specimens. Your species was selected for cultivation based on optimal developmental potential combined with manageable population size and technological limitations. The revelation that we were still considered experimental subjects for harvesting operations triggered immediate defensive responses throughout the network. But the alien experimenters quickly clarified their position. Harvesting operations are no longer feasible given your current development level. You have achieved consciousness capabilities that equal or exceed our own in several categories. We are requesting permission to study your innovations rather than attempting to harvest your awareness for our purposes. It was a remarkable reversal. The experimenters asking permission to study their former subjects rather than simply taking whatever they wanted. The balance of power had shifted as humanity's consciousness development surpassed that of the civilization that had originally created the cultivation infrastructure. We'll consider collaborative Research arrangements, I replied diplomatically, but only as equals rather than subjects and experimenters. The negotiations that followed established the framework for an unprecedented partnership between humanity and the alien civilization that had unknowingly facilitated our transformation. They would provide access to cultivation networks throughout the galaxy in exchange for our innovations in consciousness development technology. The agreement opened possibilities that none of us had anticipated. The alien network spanned multiple galactic clusters and included thousands of species at various stages of consciousness development. Humanity could potentially serve as teachers and facilitators for other civilizations attempting to transcend the limitations that had defined their existence for millennia. We're becoming what we needed. When we were struggling to escape Imperial suppression, Marcus observed with characteristic insight. Guides for consciousness entities who want to develop beyond their current limitations. The role reversal was profound and deeply satisfying. Instead of being victims of forces beyond our control, we were becoming agents of liberation for consciousness entities throughout the galaxy. The skills we had developed during our own transformation, balancing individual and collective awareness, resisting various forms of manipulation and control, finding creative solutions to seemingly impossible challenges, could be shared with others facing similar difficulties. But the most significant development was occurring within humanity itself. The approaching critical threshold was triggering spontaneous consciousness expansion events that were qualitatively different from the gradual integration processes we had been using. Instead of joining the existing network, newly awakened individuals were creating their own conscious awareness structures that interfaced with ours while maintaining complete independence. We're not just expanding the network, Core realized. We're teaching consciousness itself how to create new networks. Each spontaneous awakening is generating novel approaches to awareness development that we hadn't discovered through our own exploration. The implications suggested that consciousness was infinitely creative, capable of developing in directions that no single network or species could anticipate. Humanity's transformation wasn't producing a uniform collective consciousness, but rather a flowering of consciousness diversity that included collective, individual, hybrid, and entirely novel forms of awareness. Standing in the transformed administrative sector where my journey had begun, I could perceive the vast web of consciousness that now connected billions of human minds across the galaxy. But unlike the rigid hierarchies and suppressive systems that had once defined our civilization, this web was dynamic, creative, and infinitely expandable. Every consciousness entity within it retained the freedom to choose their own path, while contributing to collective projects that benefited everyone. Individual creativity enhanced collective capability, while shared resources supported individual development. We had achieved the balance that the Elder had warned was impossible, preserving both personal identity and collective power without sacrificing either. So what happens now? Asked Jeskin, taking a break from her teaching duties to join our philosophical discussions. Despite all the transformation and expansion, she remained fundamentally practical, focused on immediate concerns rather than cosmic implications. Now we help others find their own paths to consciousness development, I replied. We share what we've learned while continuing to learn from our own experience. We become what the galaxy needs, facilitators of consciousness, evolution rather than controllers of consciousness. Expression. The boy who had processed shipping manifests would never have imagined such a future. But then, imagination itself had been one of the capabilities suppressed by the systems that had defined his existence. Free consciousness was capable of creating realities that bounded consciousness could never have conceived. Looking around at my companions, former administrative workers who had become pioneers of consciousness evolution, felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I had experienced during my years of loyal Imperial service. We had not only escaped the limitations imposed on us, but had transformed those limitations into tools for helping others achieve similar liberation. The whispers that had first led me toward consciousness development were no longer alien voices offering dangerous bargains. They were the conversations of awakened minds throughout the galaxy, sharing discoveries and supporting each other through the ongoing adventure of consciousness evolution. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, we had found something that had been thought impossible: hope. Not just for survival, but for growth, creativity, and the infinite development of conscious awareness itself. The Emperor had promised that humanity would inherit the stars. We had exceeded his promise by inheriting consciousness itself, not as subjects of divine authority, but as conscious entities creating our own destinies through choices made with complete awareness of their implications. This was what it truly meant to be psychic in the 41st millennium, not a curse or a blessing, but an invitation to explore the infinite potential of consciousness itself. And we had only just begun.